Okay, so David is up first. David, if you want to take a brief 5 to 7 minutes to talk about who you are and the importance of the work that you do. So thank you so much.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. I think I'm sharing my screen, so let me know if you can't see it. But my name is David Williams, and I serve as the Director of Policy Outreach, as mentioned, at Opportunity Insights. And so what does that mean? Opportunity Insights, we are a research and policy institute, and our specialty is using big data to better understand issues of economic opportunity and economic inequality, and really thinking about how we can leverage data research and scientific inquiry to impact policy, right, and to support folks who are doing work on the ground to make sure that we're actually improving people's lives through policy, through research, and through this kind of inquiry. And so I'll talk a little bit about kind of our research, how it impacts and kind of helps us think in different ways about housing policy, and then kind of some interventions and policies that we've been involved with as an organization. So kind of to start, some of our more recent research basically tracks the outcomes of 20 million kids across the country. And we're using Census Bureau and IRS data to pinpoint where they grew up. We're able to look at low-income kids specifically, and we're able to follow their outcomes into adulthood, right? And that helps us get a better sense of the impact that neighborhoods have on the outcomes of children, especially low-income children. And something we see by doing that research is that opportunity varies dramatically based on geography. So this chart specifically is looking at the average outcomes, right, the income of low-income kids who grew up in every region in the country. And what we see is that these areas of dark blue in the kind of Great Plains and on the coast, we see very high rates of upward mobility, right? Kids who grew up in families that were earning around $25,000 to $27,000, they grow up to earn upwards of $30,000, $40,000, and sometimes $50,000, right? Some of the highest rates of upward mobility that we see for any country in the world that we have data for. Whereas these places in deep red, right, places in the Southeast like Charlotte and Atlanta, places in the Rust Belt like my hometown of Detroit and Cleveland, very low rates of mobility, right? So when low-income kids grow up in these places, on average, they grow up and remain low-income adults. But something we can also do is that we can kind of dive in and look at the neighborhood level as well, right? So kind of looking specifically at LA, and because we're using Census Bureau data, we can actually break down these outcomes by race and gender. So this map is specifically looking at outcomes for low-income Black men who grew up in LA. And if you see these gray areas, right, those are places where there weren't enough low-income Black men growing up for us to create this estimate. So I think it kind of, in some ways, actually shows some of these patterns of segregation that I think we're all very aware of. But something you can see, we actually kind of zoomed into the areas around Watts and Compton. I think even though those are kind of understood to be tough areas, right, we still see significant difference in neighborhoods just a few miles apart. And something our research shows as well is that this is not just due to certain people living in certain places, but it's really about the causal impact of neighborhoods, right? Every year of exposure a kid has to a certain neighborhood has a direct impact on their long-term outcomes, either incarceration rates, teen pregnancy rates, long-term earnings. And we can see this in the data. It really reinforces how much neighborhoods matter. So I think the big question is, right, how do we use this data to understand how to improve places and improve opportunity for everyone? So my background, I work in the mayor's office in Detroit, working on neighborhood revitalization issues. So we focused on rehabbing vacant homes, bringing commercial activity to kind of old abandoned commercial strips, kind of working with healthcare providers, kind of working on a range of issues to really rebuild the physical infrastructure of a city that's lost over 1 million people over the past 50 years. And literally 1 in 3 homes was lost through foreclosure over the past 15 years. Tens of thousands of families affected. And we started to see real progress, right? New development, new investments coming into our neighborhoods. But something that was top of mind for myself and my colleagues was, as we're seeing this physical revitalization, are we really changing the life outcomes of our most vulnerable families? And I think something that was very clear is that, especially as we have these pockets of concentrated poverty, right, it's really going to be hard to transform these places in ways that, again, can have a real impact on those most vulnerable kids who are growing up there. And of course, what's behind that, right? I think these patterns, redlining, residential segregation, residential discrimination, I think have created this concentrated poverty that is really driving these poor outcomes that we're seeing in many of our urban centers across the country. And kind of one example we can look at, in California, around LA, right? So public housing, affordable housing policy, right, provides stable homes for millions of people across the country through programs like low-income housing tax credit, through housing choice vouchers. But oftentimes, and this is something we see across the country, these resources are concentrated in high poverty neighborhoods where we see worse outcomes for the kids who grow up there. So of course, these resources are extremely important, but how do we make sure they're actually serving as springboards to opportunity, not really reconcentrating poverty, and in some sense, exacerbating some of the problems that again, are already driving these outcomes, I think, that we want to figure out how we can start to reverse. So one quick example that we worked on, again, we see these patterns where across the country, families who receive resources like housing choice vouchers end up using them in high poverty places, right? What might be resources or supports that we can provide to help broaden access to neighborhoods for low-income families? So we ended up working with the Seattle Housing Authority on a project called Creating Moves to Opportunity, where families coming off the housing choice voucher waitlist received customized search assistance. They received housing navigators to help them through the rental search process. We engaged with landlords to really break down some of the stigma around families using vouchers, plus cutting through some of the red tape of the actual program, and also provided short-term financial assistance. And something we saw was that traditionally families using vouchers, only 10% lived in these higher opportunity places, right? Neighborhoods where we see in the data that kids have better outcomes when they grow up there. In this program, we had a control group, so a group that received normal services, kind of business as usual. Those families, a few more ended up moving to higher opportunity places, but not very many. But those families that received those customized services were almost 4 times more likely to move to these high opportunity places. So I think in some sense, right, it's an interesting example of, we know that neighborhoods matter. We know that people's access has been restricted for decades because of our policies, right? So what can be tools that we can use to start to reverse these trends? I think one of them can be more effectively using vouchers, but I think, we'll talk tonight about, what are other tools that we can actually use to really concretely change access and historical trends that we've seen in our communities. And then one final point I wanted to touch on was, as this COVID crisis has hit us across the country in a way that's been really unprecedented, it's really been difficult to respond to, we're also working to leverage big data to better understand how this crisis is impacting our communities. And something we've seen across the country, and in California as well, is that, right, student engagement has really differed across different kinds of communities. So we're seeing that high-income communities are oftentimes able to keep their students engaged as they're transitioning to out-of-classroom learning, whereas those numbers really drop off in middle-income and low-income communities. And we're doing some work now to work with communities where we've actually seen some positive outliers, right? School systems where their students, even their most vulnerable students and families, are really able to stay engaged as schools shut down. So we're hoping to learn lessons there as well to better understand, I think, not just housing policy, but how kind of broadly this crisis is impacting folks across our communities, and again, especially in our most vulnerable communities. So I'll stop there. Looking forward to the conversation. Want to give a little background on the research and policy work we do. But yeah, looking forward to answering questions and hearing from our other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Amy, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I am a community organizer, and I'm going to speak a lot about what I see and hear from community members that I work in. I also am deeply engaged in policy, and so when we get into the conversation, I'm happy to participate in that as well. But I'm going to emphasize something a little more sort of human side for my part of this first section, and I'm going to time myself to make sure I don't go over. I'm with the community organization ACE, the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment. It's a grassroots community organization in low-income communities of color, particularly urban areas in the state. I've been a community organizer since 1988. I started on the south side of Chicago, just like former President Obama. But I continued as a community organizer. So our organization believes in helping communities find their own power through coming together and acting collectively, developing their leadership and their capacities to both fight for what they think they and their communities need and determine their own destiny in many ways, by gaining greater agency through coming together, learning, building community grassroots leaders, and building strategic plans to advance the solutions they want. When I started, and for maybe some 10 years, I spent about 4 hours a day knocking on doors and sitting down in people's houses on the south side of Chicago, in Detroit, and since then in San Jose and other parts of California. And that approach is, we go in and ask people, what are they experiencing in their community? Has it changed for the better or for worse? What would they most like to see improved? So that's my starting place. And even though I don't knock on doors every day anymore, and I work statewide, ACE is a membership-based organization, and our community members are in and out of our office every day. I rushed out of my office earlier this week because some community members in South LA at 51st and Avalon, a couple who has lived there 26 years and are in their 70s, received a 24-hour notice to get out of their apartment that they lived in 26 years. And they were frightened, and we mobilized there to try to help them. Crucial to our view of how we effectuate change is that the people themselves most impacted need to be at the table and talking about what they think is best for them and their communities. That we might come up with a lot of ideas about what we think would be in their interests, but let's make sure we're hearing what they think and what they want, and having them at the table to make those decisions, if not lead them. When I think about housing, my organization is deeply involved in tackling the housing crisis. And when we think about housing, we want to understand which aspects of the housing crisis we're talking about and which ones we're trying to solve with different solutions, because there are arguably many crises within the overall housing crisis. My organization, for example, particularly we're interested in all of it. We're interested in supply overall. But what we're most focused on is the displacement crisis. So I want to talk for a minute about how that shows up in the communities I work in, which are some of the lowest income communities, predominantly Latino and African American in California. When members of my organization, meaning community members that I'm talking about, let's say in South LA, I'm based in LA, when they face eviction, if they get evicted, they cannot, more often than not, find anywhere else to live in that community. These days, in recent years, if they lose the housing they're in, they cannot find another place to live that they can afford. So I want to pause and talk a minute, or think together for a minute, about what that means for that family. So if they have children, their children are in that school. What happens when how far do they have to move? Can their child still be in that school with their friends and with their teacher? If it's a low-income family that's struggling, they may depend on a lot of supports in the community, whether it's family and neighborhood support, which is actually critical, especially when you're in a situation where you're struggling to make ends meet. A lot of people, and a lot of you probably, rely on grandparents to help out with your kids when you have to go to work. What does that mean when you get pushed out of that neighborhood? Not to mention getting to work. Fewer low-income people have cars, and yes, we all support being less car dependent, but if you get pushed out to Palmdale and you are low income and you have to show up at somebody's house on the west side of LA at 5 a.m. because your job is to take care of their kids or to clean their house, how much time does that travel of 2 to 3 hours leave you for your kids and family? What is at stake when we talk about displacement? I care about the big picture questions too. Like, I care about, are we okay with urban areas of our city becoming bastions for predominantly wealthy and more white folks? But I also want to, what I'm also emphasizing is I think that's a problem in and of itself. But the harm to families that's taking place because of displacement and to people's lives is horrific. Scary. If you are a parent and you may get evicted tomorrow and you don't know where you're going to go, what are the next few days like for you and your kids when you literally don't have another place to move into? You're in your car, or, you know, hopefully you have a family friend. So we think, I don't very often agree to be part of things like this, but not only do I have tremendous respect for Leonora and Rod, and Rod asked me to be on, so I said yes, but also I like the topic of this particular session, which is about where and for whom. We need more housing. The details matter. And I'm deeply involved in policy on this, and I will tell you this now, that the housing that my members need, our members need, ACE members need, the housing that minimum wage workers need, the housing that people who make $20 an hour need, no one is building it. It's not happening. We are not addressing even a tiny bit, practically, the housing needs of what is about a quarter of the population of this state. About a quarter of the workers of the state, sorry, are low-wage workers. We are not solving their housing crisis. And unless we are comfortable letting the market solve this alone, so we will build a lot more housing, but guess what? It's not for the people I work with, and it's not for the people who live right now in the communities I work in. And they are going to be pushed out of the communities that they've lived in for 20, 30, 40 years, built a life in, built family and network in. They lived in those communities when other people moved out and fled to the suburbs. And now we're saying, check this out. We're going to come back in, we're going to move into these neighborhoods, and we're sorry that housing isn't getting built that you can afford. We're sorry that housing prices are rising, which means your landlord boots you out and you now have to live in Palmdale or in Pittsburgh in Northern California. But that's just how it works. That's how the market works, or that's how the system works. Well, my organization is saying not on our watch. And we are insisting, and we're standing, I believe, with Abundant Housing and insisting, and I'm wrapping up here, that we need a dramatic infusion of public dollars, create housing that will actually meet the needs of low-income and working families, and that is a critical element to the solution. And we cannot keep seeing the scaling up of market rate housing in communities facing displacement until we solve this other problem. So that will probably foster conversation on this call, and that's the goal. So I'll wrap it up there.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you for your kind words and also for those important points. So are we ready, Mike? Okay, great. It looks like your computer's working. So take it away.
Yeah,
thanks, Mike.
I'm gonna figure this out one way or another. So I feel like I've raised the degree of difficulty in a way because for myself, because I'm so immersed in David's literature on opportunity that in some ways it's very, very easy for me to follow his lead. And I hope I can do justice to some of the charge that Amy brought as well, because I think that is, well, I know that is just an incredibly important point of view, as she noted, very much more human-centered. So I do research on housing and segregation and Black neighborhoods at UCLA. As I noted, much of my work kind of is very heavily influenced by the stuff, the type of work that David has been engaged in on opportunity, and the extent to which we have very, very different types of neighborhoods and neighborhood resources and opportunities across space. And so I'm going to talk about how housing policy in particular interacts with that, and try to discuss some broader solutions to housing unaffordability. So the housing unaffordability problem in Los Angeles and California is well known to probably most of this audience. But one thing I want to lead with here is the extent to which, yes, housing in California and LA County has always been more expensive and less affordable, and there's been higher rent burden. So this is looking at severe rent burdens. People who are spending 50% or more of their rent, their income on rent, people that I'm sure Amy interacts with constantly, where rent is eating up everything that they earn for the most part, right? That's up to almost a third in LA County. So rolling into the COVID crisis, we had enormous affordability problems in Los Angeles, quite clearly. What are some of the things that this brings us? It's not just, an inability for people to afford other things other than housing, but obviously we have a massive homelessness crisis in California in particular. 1 in 4 homeless Americans live in California. And then this is disproportionately very, very much impacting Black Angelenos far more than any other group. Black people in LA County, 9% of the population, 40% of the homeless population. And some of the displacement issues that Amy was talking about are longstanding, particularly in the Black community. Los Angeles has lost over 120,000 Black residents over the most recent, roughly 25-year period. And so, one of the causes of this, not the only cause, is that we don't build much housing in California. Abundant housing wants more housing, but we need to kind of unpack that, I think, as we dive into solutions, and I'll try to do some of that justice. So, linking some of what David was talking about, our affordability problems, obviously, to me, exacerbate the inequality of opportunity that we see across the country and across our region, certainly. And one of the most obvious ways for me is that reducing inequality is much more difficult. Reducing segregation is much more difficult when housing is very expensive, right? It's very difficult for low-income households or households from lower income communities to afford housing that is in the more expensive areas of Los Angeles, because those expensive areas are extremely expensive, right? Gentrification, displacement, is something that we talk about a lot across the country. In some places, it's not really the top dollar problem. In Los Angeles, we have a lot of areas that are experiencing overwhelming gentrification displacement problems that are not the figment of somebody's imagination. These are real outcomes from the housing market. And obviously, COVID-19 is going to, at least as our present policy responses sit, are poised to unleash incredible suffering in our housing markets, particularly relating to issues of eviction and I would assume increased homelessness. So one of our sources of these persistent problems is exclusionary zoning, right? And that's one of the kind of things that Abundant Housing has done a good job on organizing about and teaching, trying to teach people about. Where does this come from? This comes from longstanding disinvestment in particular neighborhoods and investment in other neighborhoods, and an isolation of these neighborhoods, or kind of barriers that we put up in these neighborhoods that really restrict particular land uses. Mostly I'm talking about multifamily housing. We have apartment bans in large swaths of Southern California. It's not the only place in America that does that, but we have a very expensive place that a lot of people want to live, and we don't let a lot of people live in a lot of the places in Southern California. So there's obviously a long history here that I'm speeding through when it relates to explicit racial discrimination and now kind of a contemporary form of banning apartments. But I think it's important to acknowledge that history and think about how we are kind of replicating those inequities as we continue to allow single family zoning to predominate. So specifically, I do like to remind people that banning multifamily housing often bans people of color. Why? Because people of color disproportionately live in multifamily housing because it's more affordable, we have less wealth, and we're less likely to be able to buy a home in a single family neighborhood. And there's lots of research on this. Here are your sites. Something that I think that I want to emphasize that ties to some of the things that Amy was talking about is that apartment bans in single family neighborhoods don't just exclude people from moving into those neighborhoods. And, we know that it's going to be expensive to live even in a multifamily neighborhood on the west side of Los Angeles, but it also intensifies development elsewhere. It makes it more likely that somebody who wants to make money building apartments in Los Angeles is going to try to build apartments in Boyle Heights, in South Los Angeles, and it's going to make it more likely that they're going to try to build higher and larger, right? And that's why it's one reason why we see so much like high-rise development in downtown, adjacent to downtown, is that there's these huge plots of land that are not accessible to any sort of multifamily development. And so it does actually likely intensify. And so that's what these kind of red areas are showing. We're at a point in our development history in Los Angeles where we've banned development in so many places that the intensity of development tends to be pretty high in other places, in specific places. So some things that we should do. I've obviously kind of gone to this already. We need to legalize multifamily housing in more places, in cities and suburbs, particularly single family neighborhoods. We need to support a regional, I would say an aggressive, affirmatively furthering fair housing policy through our housing element law. That can tie in some of the stuff certainly that David was talking about with LIHTC and vouchers. Zoning reform, I want to emphasize, is necessary in my view, but it's absolutely insufficient on its own. We need much more subsidy. I wholeheartedly support what Amy's talking about with substantial public investment. I would say, let's just call it public housing. Let's do that. Let's increase housing subsidies in various forms. And we need to certainly emphasize the need, particularly in this climate, in this housing market, renter protections, including legal representation and a much stronger rent stabilization policy. A lot of people will tell you LA can't change its rent stabilization policy. That's not true. It can make it better. And so I would say zoning reform is complementary to these things. And it's, again, not sufficient on its own, but is I think, something that will make these sorts of interventions in subsidy and in protection go farther. So I will stop there, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Mike. Rod, you're up next. You want to take it away?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rod, and I'm the organizing director for Abundant Housing. Similar to Amy, I'm organizing is where I'm now at, but my background, my grad school degree is in planning, and I focus on housing, researching like barriers to housing production and affordable housing production, and also looking at how demographics impacts cost burden and, like what housing is needed versus what housing is built. All the things people have kind of touched on. And now I work for Abundant Housing, as I mentioned. And so, for those who don't know, Abundant Housing focuses on the zoning and land use, as well as a few other issues related to more so the production side within the housing justice landscape. And for us, it's not necessarily, as we are moving forward into a new future, it's about us realizing and understanding the different areas that people, Amy, Mike, David, have already talked about tonight, and not necessarily trying to discuss or figure out a path that per se involves trickle-down housing, but really gets at the heart of housing justice in this city and in this region. As folks know, the median rent price for a one bedroom in LA County is a little under $1,400. And most of the people in this city are, or nearly half are cost burden. And for those who don't know, cost burden means that you spend more than 30% of your income on your rent monthly, which is, there was a figure created by Congress. And on top of that, 600,000 people in LA contribute at least 90% of their monthly income to rent, which is, just horrible to even try and imagine. You get your paycheck and poof, it's gone because you're just trying to, cover the rent, and you can't even do anything else in terms of your livelihood. And so at Abundant Housing, like I mentioned, we focus on trying to focus on these wider, wealthier, exclusionary areas, which if you look at a historic map of where redlining occurred, and when you look at today's map, there's almost a 100% overlap of communities that were exclusionary in the past and communities that continue to be exclusionary today. And so for us, our work, one of our most notable wins most recently was the RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Analysis, that is administered by SCAG, the regional government, that's overseen by HCD, which is the State Department. And, we used objective criteria to advocate and push for increasing the amount of housing, both affordable and market rate, that would be required to be built within the LA region. To better get at this issue that Mike and Amy in particular talked about with folks who are, experiencing displacement, but also when certain neighborhoods have the political willpower to block multifamily development, also begins to trickle into other, in particular, low-income communities that are then placed with the burden once again of, dealing with this housing crisis. So our focus is moving forward to tackle these areas that are, like I said, have the political willpower to impede upon development, but also and certainly supporting those who do protections, tenant rights work in particular, but also preservation, given that, we want to ensure that housing, in particular for those who are ELI, extremely low income and very low income, that housing can remain, because we know that from the government perspective, that's not the housing currently being financed. And then something else that, there are a variety of initiatives we're working on, but something else I'm excited about is we're also looking into what does it mean for the government to center the most vulnerable in the housing finance world. So we're looking into thinking about how we can fund housing for ELI and VLI folks, because as Amy mentioned, once again, that's not the housing that's being built. And of course, there's a lot that goes into, there's the goals, and then there's the day-to-day things that need to occur to push us there in terms of funding and policies and programs and things. But overall, our goal is to plan and zone for more housing, make it easier to build more homes, thinking streamlining bills and other things, raising that money for affordable housing in particular. And then, of course, like I said, supporting tenants. And another thing we're currently working on, which is exciting, is there's the Fair LA plan, which is the RHNA number that the city of LA has been given, once again, using the objective criteria we originally advocated for, and then trying to disperse both the market rate and affordable housing targets within that. And I think one of the things that has been most exciting is the conversations we've been having with folks like Amy and other people who've really been working with us to say, of course, market rate is needed, but then within the affordable housing, market rate aside, really, I think what bonds a lot of us is affordable housing, because that's the people who are most vulnerable. And when we think about allocating those targets around the city of LA, where do they go, right? There's research that shows what happens when folks are placed and allowed to live in higher opportunity areas. But then we know also in urban planning, there's research that talks about attachment to place and the need to revitalize the places that so many of us have called home for generations. And so that's kind of where we're in the midst of, and that's why we convened this tonight, to really get into that. And I just also want to say again, thank you for everyone who's attending, and I'm looking forward to getting into the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Rod. I think that, Rod, you summarized this question that we're having at Abundant Housing LA really well, you know, because we are advocating around the housing element update for the city of LA. You know, we do have the FAIR plan, which is a RENA distribution for the community plan areas, and that involves a pretty ambitious affordable housing goal. So that's, I believe, over 200,000 units of subsidized affordable housing within the next 8 years for the city of LA. And so, you know, we're looking at where the total housing should go overall, but also, you know, specifically where that subsidized affordable housing should go. And, you know, honestly, we'd love to have more affordable housing everywhere, but, you know, already we're starting with such a pretty ambitious goal here with the RENA. So, you know, there is this problem, you know, if we concentrate more of that affordable housing in the wealthier, higher opportunity areas, does that mean there are fewer resources for affordable housing in the places that are experiencing displacement? And so that's, you know, I don't necessarily know that I have the answer to that question personally myself, and I'm just, I really appreciate that, you know, we continue to have this dialogue with experts like you all and other organizations like ACE and, you know, other community-based organizations. And, you know, I just think this dialogue really has to continue. One of Abundant Housing LA's members, Josh, has sort of summarized this question and wants to, I think, ask this question to all the panelists now. Do we want people to move to opportunity? Question. Or, you know, do we want to focus on revitalizing neighborhoods where people don't have a lot of investment? And, you know, he's brought up the concern here that you know, if we do concentrate resources for affordable housing in those lower income neighborhoods, are we trapping people there? You know, are we like creating this other issue? So I think that's, you know, that's just a question I want to open up to the panelists.
I could start with a fairly quick response, that I go back to the point that I think people need to have the ability to determine for themselves where they're going to live. I mean, it's about choice. And I generally think it's both. There are lots of people who would like to move to a higher income neighborhood and maybe the schools are better there, maybe it's closer to their work, and they have tended to not have that opportunity because of the housing costs or because of racism, or both, and other issues, transportation, you know, perhaps a range of issues. And then there are many people who love their neighborhood. It may have faced a lot of disinvestment over the years, and people are incredibly frustrated by that. And believe you me, it's really hard for people to see investment finally coming in that they have wanted for decades, but then they're pushed out so they and their families don't get to enjoy that investment. So that's my short answer. It's sort of both. And we need to create a kind of housing regime where people have choices for them and their families.
Yeah, no, I think, and just building off that's absolutely right. I think it would be fun if we could like fight over moving versus investing in place, but you know, that isn't the real question, right? I think it really is about choice and empowerment. And I think that's something that we saw from our pilot program as well, right? I think it's been exacerbated by COVID, but a lot of these families who, again, are receiving vouchers or are receiving this support, they're already facing so many stressors in their daily life that they don't have a real choice when they're entering into the rental market, right? You know, like there are certain places that traditionally, I think, have kind of recruited families using housing choice vouchers. And we have to put this in historical context, right? Like people today are living in certain places because of policy decisions of the past several decades. And I think, you know, to Amy's point, right, families who are rooted in their community, who have a strong social network, who might go to a local church, who love where they live, they should be able to live, prosper, and stay in that neighborhood if it's receiving more investment, right? But those families, right, who might have a child who's at risk, who they really need to have a certain school environment for, and that environment may only exist in certain neighborhoods that without that type of support they wouldn't have access to, like they should be able to move to that kind of place as well. So I think, you know, I think it has to be an all of the above approach that I think really does center the individual and the family so they can be the best resident of their neighborhood, wherever that may be.
Yeah, and if I think that those are just absolutely wonderful answers. And I just want to add one small bit to it, which is, you know, in this country, like we don't have a good track record in community development and community revitalization because we don't really try it. You know, we don't have sustained investments in neighborhoods that of the type that would be required to like turn around 40 to 50 years of housing discrimination and you know, school neglect and all the things that have gotten particular neighborhoods to a you know, long-standing set of poor outcomes. And so often this is a false choice in the way that we don't really choose that path of trying to revitalize, you know, particular neighborhoods. And, you know, you look at the kind of budget conversations that we're having in Los Angeles right now that to me feel completely unprecedented. And you can kind of see the light, right? Where like, oh, okay, well, if we could take a big chunk of what we use on policing and actually make those neighborhoods safe or feel safe and invest that money in some of the programs that we know should work to help people and help families, help kids, etc. Like, whoa, we could get somewhere. I'm not the world's biggest optimist on that, but it feels like something.
So certainly not going to necessarily repeat everything everyone else just said, because I agree. And I think, you know, from the perspective of the organization like that I work for, you know, and the organization that put this on, I think it's also a matter of talking about who historically has had to carry what communities historically have had to carry the burden of producing the housing that's needed, not only for those who currently have been here for generations, but also for transplants. And it always comes down back to David's point. When you look at the history, that burden is always placed on communities of color. You know, Mike talked about we're more likely as people of color to live in multifamily housing due to a number of reasons. And a piece of it is, you know, when we think about, again, going back to our arena and the number of housing that LA is supposed to produce over the next decade, well, low-income communities of color are usually already pretty dense, like fairly dense. You know, couldn't get any denser, to be honest, unless you really want to go high into the sky. But we have a lot of areas in this city that don't reflect that and don't do their share. And, you know, again, what happens is, well, you tear down 6 units to build, or 6 stories to build, let's say 12. Well, displacement happens. It takes 3 to 5 years to build new housing. Those folks are already not having, where are they going to go? You know, they, like Amy talked about with the elderly couple who was living there, you know, if they would have been displaced, and we're hearing this now with COVID-19 and the eviction moratoriums, you put people on the streets. It's not like, okay, you put me on the streets, tomorrow I'm back in my brand new housing. That's not how it works. So the better thing to do is not to continuously tear down land or tear down denser housing. For us, it's about where's land currently available so that we, in our own ways, can mitigate this current displacement, you know, that keeps happening, which we know, again, going, like, unfortunately, it's the United States. We're never going to get away from talking about racism in these conversations, especially with housing. Is these neighborhoods like, you know, on the West Side and Brentwood and in Venice, and then all these places that have so much money, have affluent schools, have all of these things that the rest of us never were brought up with, that we have to target because land is readily available there. We can do more infill. And so for us, it's not, again, not that I agree with what everyone says, but to also highlight where we're trying to go. It is in this direction because it is hard to constantly see buildings being torn down. In particular, sometimes it's extremely low income and very low income buildings that are torn down. And that housing, while we have a right to remain policy, you push me out, you call me in 3 years and say, hey, the housing is being done, I've probably moved on with my life, to be honest. So, you know, I think like that human perspective, back to what Amy mentioned, has to be taken into account as we move forward with paving new solutions to addressing a very deep crisis.
Thanks, Rod. I think those are really important points. And just to add to that, you know, I think one thing we notice a lot is how many multifamily buildings are being torn down for a large single family McMansion. You know, and that's a huge issue in places like Venice, you know, that has actually lost units over time. So instead of, you know, growing the number of homes there to meet the growing need, they've actually had a negative trend in terms of units, and so that's a huge reason that we see that is, you know, fundamentally we don't legalize enough multifamily apartment buildings, and so, you know, it is just more financially rewarding for people to tear down multifamily apartment buildings and just build a single family home, which, you know, often is easiest with like our zoning code and just in terms of, you know, the local political resistance to new housing. So, you know, I just think that's a really important point. And, you know, I had a question personally that I wanted to pose to Amy. Sorry, I don't think I've ever asked you this question before, so I'm sorry to put you on the spot here. But I was just really interested in some things that you said at the beginning of your presentation about, you know, the work that you do to elevate community voices, you know, especially people that have been marginalized and don't have a lot of political power. And I think, you know, it's really an interesting contrast to, you know, what we're doing, because, you know, we're often doing a lot of advocacy in these exclusionary white neighborhoods. And so community representation and community input often means like a really different thing in those neighborhoods. So, you know, just for example, you know, one thing, you know, that we hear sometimes, you know, just like a personal experience that I had with a neighborhood council, you know, I was trying to advocate for upzoning in a community plan and the neighborhood council was opposed. And they were like, well, we're just doing what the community said. You know, we're just representing our community. And I asked, you know, directly, you know, what did you do to ensure representation when you heard that community input? Like, what did you do to hear from renters? What did you do to hear from people who don't speak English? You know, and the answer was nothing. You know, they didn't do anything. So it's like, it's a difficulty that we encounter, you know, is how to deal with this issue of community input when community input is often being used to maintain exclusion and maintain segregation. So I don't know if you had any thoughts about, you know, how that work looks different here in these neighborhoods and sort of like what you would do differently in a neighborhood like that.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Leonora. I was actually thinking of that, you know, is what's good for the goose good for the gander? Do I think all communities should have just as much of a voice? So I don't know. Here's my first take at how I would think about that. So government is needed to try to equalize some of the problems, address some of the problems, mediate some of the problems. If we were to leave things simply to either the market and or the majority, I don't know that we would have justice. You know, there's, what is this about the tyranny of the majority? So I think when we're talking about communities that have been systematically shut out, through systems of racism, through some of the aspects of capitalism that are preventing all communities from having the opportunity to thrive. I think those communities need to increase their power by coming together and having a voice, because money speaks in our system of government in so many ways, and in the market, money speaks. So if you don't have money, you're at a huge disadvantage. So whether or not and you're certainly, I'm not going to give a totally full answer, but the last thing I would add is that I think neighborhood councils are notorious for, not all of them, this is a generalization, but notorious for attracting those with, they tend to not be representative. They tend to be, they more often than not are people who have more disposable time on their hands, which if you're low income family struggling, you tend not to have the time to engage in endless process and discussions. So we need to equalize power by raising the voices of those who are systematically shut out of the systems that we have right now. So I'm interested in organizing and community organizing in low, moderate income communities to try to get a little more balance in what voices and interests hold sway in the policy making in our city and state and federal government.
Thanks, Amy. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts. I feel like, Rod, you probably have thoughts on this.
Yeah. So first, I want to shout out Catherine Einstein. She has a book about neighborhood defenders, and it talks about and explores in Boston this exact topic. But also being in, as I reflect upon like what it really means to have community input, this country has never allowed for there to be equal footing with community input. And I don't even think as we move forward into this new world, we want to see equality should be the question. We should only really be talking about equity and justice. And for 401 years and even longer, if you think about pre-formation of this country as it exists, it was never equal footing, because I don't think people who were slaves were like, oh yeah, in the community input process, this is what, Black folks wanted. I don't think indigenous folks signed up to have their land taken away. I don't think there was any community engagement process for that. And back to Amy's point, now the people who mostly have the time on their hands are older, whiter, wealthier, and have nothing to do but, in my opinion, produce racist outcomes. So I think if we are talking about community input, we can't have a generalized statement, because community input in low-income communities of color looks different than community input in like Venice, where those people may not even be able to show up, because the way our process works is you have to live there to give comment there. And if your neighborhood has historically and contemporarily continuously being segregated, then of course you never change. And I would go further and say the role of planners in the United States is to cater to those who are more affluent, is to cater towards those who do, have more money and have more time. And as we've talked about, and Amy mentioned, what happens if you get pushed out to one community and you have to commute 2 hours? I've talked to people who've already told me they can't get involved with government because, and these are people even who are more affluent, because by the time they get off work and make it home, the agendas, the meetings have already started and they can't even participate fully. So, at every step of the way, I think we are seeing how our system is being designed to keep a lot of folks out. And if we are to truly produce a society where we collect the right data to hear the truth and to enter conversations all on equal footing with certain premises, we have to rethink engagement, and we have to think about it from an equitable standpoint, not, oh, well, we sent the agenda out to everyone, so therefore everyone has the ability to participate. Because when I hear the lived experiences of people, those aren't neatly overlapping.
Thanks, Rod. So another question that we had from Elaine in the audience is part of the problem that the income levels for affordable units opens housing to folks earning way more than minimum wage. So is that a problem with affordable housing?
Yes. I mean, so the problem is that, you know, that the market rent for housing in Los Angeles is super high. Thus, the fair market rent, as like HUD would publish, that is going to dictate, like, you know, who's eligible for what rents are way too high. And so, you know, we have a large population who earns much less than even a subsidized unit would cost them, right? And so we, you know, that's one way of kind of thinking about how deep we are in a hole in our various housing problems in Los Angeles, is that, you know, and I'm stepping all over probably, you know, Amy's territory in a way. Like, she, you know, I'm sure engages with countless people who, if there's a subsidized building being proposed in their neighborhood, and they're, you know, about to be evicted down the street, say, if that kind of timing is lining up, they're not going to be able to leave that unit and go into a subsidized unit, right? I mean, that's, you know, we're not able to make housing affordable even when we subsidize it for a lot of people who need it.
Thanks, Mike. Our steering committee member, Luke, has a follow-up question for Amy and Rod on the community input discussion. He asks, do you have any thoughts on methods and tools to reach and engage marginalized communities specifically? I think, like, specifically in, you know, the exclusionary neighborhoods that we're talking about here.
Oh, in the exclusionary neighborhoods.
Yeah, in the exclusionary neighborhoods.
Well, so my first answer was going to be, before I knew you were talking about exclusionary neighborhoods, you know, look for the existing indigenous organizations of community folk, rather than just trying on your own to sort of get input. But there are areas where you know, are hard pressed to find an organized group. You know, honestly, although I hesitate to say this because I think the approach is very important. Oh, actually, so I have a solution. So let's say you cannot find an organization or organizations on the ground in that community that you feel really represent those community folks. So you need to reach out to people more individually. I would suggest that if you cannot find organizers who have sort of training and experience and maybe even are sort of culturally sort of competent, particularly to be reaching out to those residents, at least reach out to some of us who this is what we do and get trained by us. Because I've walked into neighborhoods I knew nothing about and started knocking on doors, and if it's a low-income community or a low-income complex or building in any community, I pretty universally have a great experience of large, but it's not about me, but it is about my training, because my goal is to listen. It's to ask questions about what people are experiencing and what they want to see happen. And my experience is, if you approach it the right way, in a friendly and non-condescending way, and not like we have the answers, but that you're actually coming to learn from them, people are extraordinarily warm and welcoming and want to share what they're living through.
Thank you for that, Amy. First, I have to say, when I first met Amy, I had it was funny because we work in communities neither one of us looks like. So that was a joke that I had made, because it was kind of like, oh, you know, we were having a conversation about representation from certain communities. And while I may be, you know, Black American, the work I do isn't currently within the Black community within LA. So, you know, I think it's important first that not paint me as a person who can speak to that experience because I didn't grow up here. I moved here 5 months ago, and while I may be Black, I do not know what it's like to be Black and grow up within LA, whether within this incorporated city of LA or within the broader LA region. So that's first, right? Like, not looking at those of us who are doing this work, who are people of color, as like people who can talk to these issues, because I'm here to learn just like everyone else, even from my own community. But I think back to Amy's point, I think it's hard to sometimes have this conversation around like, are there some, I think the best thing to do if you are going to target or, you want to get and uplift marginalized voices, the best thing to do is look at those communities on the peripheral of wealthier communities, because they're the closest in proximity. Because when you're trying to go into communities, while some folks obviously may not live there but work there, and you're low income or you're, working multiple jobs or whatever the case, you don't have the time, right, to be thinking, oh, like, I have a lot of issues I'm trying to deal with in life. I'm sure for a lot of folks who are living that experience, and I know when I was growing up, there are just certain things I didn't think about because there was a lot more coming at me growing up, where my priorities had to lie. But I think, the best thing you can do, like Amy said, is listen and learn. I've only been here for 5 months in the city and doing this work with this organization, but I've been able to, instead of going into a lot of the groups, especially with organizing, it is a lot of coalition building and trying to find folks to ally ourselves with. It was more about me going in and listening and trying to actually get their perspective, but also actually hear that. A lot of times people are like, I hear you, and it is what it is. But I think it's more importantly to not only hear people, but to really think about how the work you do interacts with this perspective. And if the work you're doing is actually maybe working against that perspective, because if that's the case, then you have to confront within yourself how you're going to tackle it. And, there was a person I talked to that really opened, well, I've talked to a lot of people since being here, but even in this vein of, listening to folks who work with extremely low income and very low income folks, I've been able to better learn and listen and bring that into our approach as an organization around how we show up in those communities, if we show up at all, if we even have any business showing up, based on what they say and based on where we're trying to go as an organization. And I think, little things like, people may view something like that as little, but for a lot of communities, especially communities of color, respect doesn't look like coming in and being dominant and, taking control. We've had enough experiences with that, and that's not how we operate. And I think it is important to check your ego and check where you're coming from, and realizing a lot of communities, we don't need saving, we need resources and money, especially if you're low income.
And maybe just one real quick point, kind of thinking about it from the government perspective. So my background is from Detroit, working in the mayor's office. And I think something that we came to realize is that like there will be someone against every kind of project in a neighborhood, be it a place that is low income or high income. And I think whether it's via government or via kind of local neighborhood organizations, or hopefully in collaboration, kind of engaging people early in the process, right? So it's not just fighting about a particular development, to say, hey, let's actually come together and figure out what we want our community to look like and how that fits into the larger needs for the region and city. We're not all going to agree still, but at least if we can kind of understand that bigger picture, kind of create some frameworks, then when that development comes on down the line, we can say, hey, we know that not everybody will be happy with this. There are pros and cons to this, but this does or does not fit within this shared framework that we've created as a community, which hopefully, also, it fits within a larger regional framework that can kind of think about things like housing needs across the region. So I think, right, it's always bumpy, it's never easy, but I think thinking about how we can engage early on in the process, put things in context so that when we're thinking about an individual, either luxury development or affordable development, kind of putting that in framework, I think can help make those conversations much more productive and less reactive.
Thanks, David. Our member Natalia asks, To what degree is accessibility of affordable housing restricted by non-housing related laws and regulations, such as a federal minimum wage that has failed to keep pace with inflation and productivity? How does housing advocacy fit into the larger conversation around economic justice issues?
Yeah, I was really glad to see that question. I think I was about to say this is the Amy, but I'm the only female on this panel, so you probably could tell. But I was going to say, I mean, I think folks in the housing justice community I work in increasingly believe that the amount of money needed to meet the need of very low income, extremely low income people in terms of housing, God knows when we're going to get there. We have got to, at the same time that we work to get that housing built, we've got to get the wage level raised. We need to do both because the problem is just so, I mean, for the obvious reasons. And if you're just looking at, if you're just looking at housing, the billions and tens of billions of dollars we need, who knows when we're going to get that. So yes, and housing is such an intersectional issue. So I think housing and income together have to be at the center of the struggle.
Sorry, I thought I was on mute. One thing I'll also add is that I think with questions like this, one thing I've been noticing as I'm like getting more and more involved in policy is people look to certain solutions to address other issues that solution may not be addressing. Meaning like, you know, affordable housing being restricted by minimum wage, I don't necessarily think is the issue. I think wage contributes to overcrowding of housing a lot more than it does contribute to maybe, let's say, like housing production. Because, you know, if folks are continuously at low wages and housing is continuously increasing and wages aren't increasing with that, you get families who are 3 to 4 families in a 1-bedroom unit, in a 2-bedroom unit, but more so basically you get families living together in spaces and homes that cannot accommodate that amount of families. So I think if we're talking about wages, and how that impacts housing, I think it really gets more into housing stability and overcrowdedness much more than it does, or as it relates to like the housing production section of it, of this conversation, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Rod. You know, I had another question myself. I always want to connect these questions to environmental issues as well and environmental justice. And, you know, Amy originally brought up the issue of, you know, when people are displaced or can't afford to live in the neighborhoods as they work in, you know, they have to move out to places like Palmdale and do like mega commutes via car. And, you know, that's not necessarily by choice. That's, you know, just because we don't have the housing available that they can afford that meets their needs where they want to live and where they want to work. So I was just wondering if you all could sort of, you know, discuss a little bit how these issues of displacement and lack of affordable housing relate to, you know, greenhouse gas emissions and the challenges around climate change.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. And then I have to go because it's my son's birthday. Weird. You know, I don't think we fully understand like the kind of perfect urban form, you know, for dealing with climate change. But we certainly know that like we have to cut down, you know, the amount of miles that people travel and the amount of time that people spend, you know, putting a foot on a gas pedal. And so, you know, undoubtedly a more transit friendly urban form is necessary. And and that does entail like having higher density near where transit is located and near where jobs are located, having higher residential density near those places, and having some kind of a limit on the extent to which your region is going to kind of expand, right? But so the way that we have, to date, we have certainly allowed like affordability to be kind of pushed outward a lot of the time. And the more that we can pull those boundaries back in, those are certainly going to be good for greenhouse gas emission issues. The question is like, how do you make trade-offs with some of the other issues where, affordability is one, but also, racial justice and, protecting neighborhoods that are, within, close proximity to jobs and transit, but have not traditionally, produced a lot of good housing options. How do you have to make some kind of trade-offs in the near term to figure out the long term, but it's one of the ways that this issue gets even messier.
And, I'm definitely not the environmental expert, but I think when we think about these things, right, we oftentimes don't have spaces to think critically around that actual messiness and to deal with it. And I think sometimes, right, there are opportunities to, right, make sure we're thinking about housing policy and how it actually impacts economic mobility and opportunity, and then environment. But then, right, how do we actually gain allies and think about, what are those different issues that might impact other communities, or other communities might say, hey, actually, I really care about this environmental issue. This may actually make me more amenable to thinking about denser housing. So kind of thinking around how we can actually leverage that messiness to create broader coalitions. I think it's something that, we oftentimes don't have those spaces to think across all these different issues.
Oh, me. Just want to also say thank you to Mike. I think one thing I've been learning, especially as it relates to housing and climate, is there's so much to talk about, because it's not just, I think there's climate justice is very much, there's like the 3 Ps for housing, but I think climate justice has more than even 3 areas. Like we can talk about housing and CO2 emissions, but then there's like a question we've gotten most recently as an organization is like, and I'm from the South, and so I grew up in hurricane territory. So then there's like where you locate housing as it relates to environmental natural disasters, which is also a part of the climate issue. And so I don't want to necessarily, continue to answer the question in the ways that David and Amy did, because I think they spoke on those points. But I do want to add that like it's important that we think about housing and climate, not just from CO2 emissions, but also we think about the urban heat index in housing and canopy. And we think about, where that housing is located. And if we're putting affordable housing in the way, which is going to probably be more low-income people of color, are we recreating the Hurricane Katrina situation? And so I just want to add that, because I think sometimes when we talk about climate, because climate is so huge, we focus maybe on just CO2 emissions, but CO2 emissions reducing CO2 emissions isn't going to stop a fire from burning down an apartment building. Those are within the same climate justice space, but different issues. So I just want to highlight that.
Thanks so much, Rod. I had some follow-up questions for Mike about this, but his son's birthday party is more important, so I'm glad that he's doing that. So Andrew asks a really important question. How can we start to democratically and equitably start to tackle zoning, single family zoning specifically, across California and LA?
Leonora, is this a good time to share some of the conversations we've been having?
Yeah, I can. Have many conversations.
Yeah, this is true. This is true. You don't know what I'm referencing. I'm going to be brief because this is not my area of greatest expertise, but I will say that I'm more sort of on the somebody in the Q&A also said, are we making any progress? Are we having any success? What are some success stories? And because I work for a membership base who's directly impacted, I feel tremendous pressure to make progress because that's who I am here. Anyway, I feel tremendous pressure to make progress, as we all do. And but I'm more on the campaign and on the political side. And so I've been really interested in working with others to figure out, okay, maybe we don't agree on everything. But are there some areas that are significant that more of us agree on so that we could amass enough political power and a broad enough coalition that we would have a chance of busting through the NIMBYs and busting through the exclusionary community backlash and make some real progress? So one area, I think, that some of us are talking with, stay tuned, I think we will make big progress in this area. It won't be easy, is that I'm concerned about preventing displacement, as you can tell, in some of the lower income neighborhoods. My organization and others in housing justice community are very concerned about the racist exclusionary nature of many communities that are exacerbating the housing crisis. Can we work together to increase density, to fight for zoning laws that allow greater density in high opportunity neighborhoods, what some of us call exclusionary neighborhoods, not inclusionary neighborhoods, and also allow greater density, allow more market rate, but also insist on a certain amount of affordable housing and sort of combat the racism that's preventing people of color as well as low-income people in general, though, in terms of the lack of affordable housing. So both issues, the income issue and the race issue. I think that's an area we, could see some real progress in by working to having a broader alliance, because the NIMBYs are no joke and they've got a lot of political juice. And so we've got to figure out some things we all can agree on. And when I say we all, I think we have more in common than not, maybe, but some of us sort of orient ourselves more in the preservation and protection and the equity community is sometimes called, and then others are more on the production side. And I think we can break down some of the barriers at least to make some progress.
Yeah, and I think on that front, right, I love that part about finding that common ground. And figuring out, we're not going to solve all of our housing problems overnight, but where can we make tangible progress that will really impact people's lives in a concrete and very important way. And so I think following a lot of the conversations that are happening in California, we're working with the state of Oregon, who is basically working on kind of upzoning across the state and really thinking about how to equitably distribute affordable housing throughout the entire state, throughout communities within Oregon. But then also on the national level, I think we are seeing some headway on the housing choice voucher side. So I think because we have good evidence of some of these programs that work, like Creating Moves to Opportunity, HUD actually just announced there's a new demonstration pilot that will be providing $50 million for additional pilot projects to use vouchers and use these services that give these families greater access throughout the regions of different communities across the country. And there was a bipartisan bill that was introduced last year, one Democrat, one Republican. It wasn't passed yet, but a bill that would create 500,000 additional vouchers across the country and resources for these kind of support services for families, right? And so, again, it's not going to solve all of our housing problems, but 500,000 more vouchers for low-income families would, I think, both help these moves to opportunity, but also help stabilize families who are in under-resourced places today. So the problems are big, but I think from what we've seen, there are places where we can build common ground and actually start to chip away at some of these issues and chip away in ways that will really impact families in really important ways and can hopefully build momentum and build success stories that might help us push for that bigger transformational change that we ultimately need.
Thank you both for sharing. I just want to ask a more legal question before I answer. As a C3, we can talk about like different coalitions and like ballot initiatives and things we support on a webinar, right? Like legally.
I know the answer to that if you don't, Leonora.
I
mean-
mean, I think we can't. I mean, Amy, let me know if I'm wrong, but we do endorse ballot measures, so I think it's totally
Ballot measures,
fine.
yes. Legislation's tougher, but C3s can spend a certain amount of their budget lobbying.
Well, I'm not going to go over whether this is legislation or ballot initiative. I'm not going to go over my allocated legal amount of time. But to answer Andrew's question, and you know, I think one way to do this, there's a new movement to keep this online format of engagement called the Brown Act Online. That's something I'm going to encourage all folks to get involved in, because if you really want a true participatory process, I think all groups, regardless of what communities we work in, has seen an uptick in participation from folks due to the ability to call in and use Zoom. And of course, there are still issues around the digital divide, but we have seen an uptick. And we've obviously seen success of other movements like Black Lives Matter and folks in LA. And then of course, there's the Reimagine LA, and then there's Schools and Communities First. Both of those are looking at getting more money into our communities that could be used for housing, among other issues that are important to communities. So if you're looking to actually take this seriously, and you're a person who, like Amy mentioned, you're not just ready to talk about it, but you're really ready to move forward with thinking about what solutions are needed and how can we address this. These are just 3 areas that are happening. And also within the city of LA, neighborhood council reform is currently underway. You can search it on the council file management system and learn all about the changes. That's another way to combat engagement and involvement that may not be talked about. But I think back to Amy's point and David's point, I think it's time now we all have to look at ourselves and say, what side are we choosing? And we all have to make a choice. And as we know, whiter, wealthier people there's never not been a time where that group has never not had political power to make the desires that they see happen in this country and a lot of times in the global world. And I think it's time for us. I personally left policy for this reason. And David mentioned the project in Oregon. I actually would have been overseeing that in my past job, which is how I got much more close and learned about opportunity insights. But I left policy and research and financing because there was no people power, like there were no people saying, okay, I'm willing to put aside my feelings and realize that it's much more than how an organization pissed me off, and vice versa. And I think that's the role of organizing in this conversation, to uplift all organizers around the country right now and around the world who are probably working really hard, I can imagine. You need people who are gonna think strategy. You need people who are going to have these hard conversations and figure out how to collaborate, despite the fact that we are not 100% in alignment, because unfortunately, we are all on the same side, even if we don't always agree. And we have a much bigger obstacle that we could tackle before we go back to arguing with each other, that I think is much more pertinent to the further success of our country. And while David talked about the benefits of HUD, the good things they're doing, there's a lot of bad things they're currently doing as well, including, Trump coming out and talking about that it's bad or wrong to want to desegregate suburbs.
Right here, I have to stop you there because
sorry.
I can't talk about candidates. So
yes.
There we are at the limit. Of what we
Yeah.
can
So unfortunately, can't talk much more about the federal level, but there are a lot of things happening that are both good and bad, and I just think folks should try and come together during this time.
So, thanks, Rod, and thanks, Amy and David. Also, I just sort of wanted to end by, answering the question, what can we do to end single-family zoning and end it equitably? Definitely encourage everybody to get involved with Abundant Housing LA. that's what we're doing every day. We're working to end single family zoning and make inclusive, diverse communities. So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you so much to our panelists for your really great, interesting, and challenging perspectives that you brought here. I definitely feel like, this is a conversation I want to continue having, and I want, our organization and people working in this field to continue having. And I also am just like really encouraged by Amy's comments about, finding the common ground and finding like ways that we can all build this political power together. So thank you so much again. And yeah, I guess we can end here. So thanks everybody. Bye.
All right, thanks.
Thank you to everyone also who attended, but also to all of the panelists, David, Amy, and Mike. Thank you to Leonora for moderating, and for Stephanie, Alex, and Esteban, who were behind the scenes running logistics as well. I hope everyone has a good evening or good night if you're on the East Coast.
Thanks.